Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a prayer spoken every single day on a million worlds. It is spoken in the cold before dawn by farmers whose names will never be recorded, by soldiers huddled in trenches, waiting for something terrible to crest the horizon, by mothers pressing the foreheads of their children against the dust of shrine room floors. It rises upward like smoke from an altar. It is breathed into the recycled air of void stations where people have never seen a sky. It is carved into walls and embroidered onto cloth and tattooed onto skin. The prayer is simple. It asks for protection. It asks the God Emperor of mankind to hold back the dark. And every one of the trillions of people who whisper that prayer believes, with a sincerity that cannot be manufactured and a faith that cannot be faked, that it reaches him. That somewhere beneath the sprawling mountain city of the Imperial Palace on Terra, sitting on a throne of impossible golden machinery, the being they call their God hears them. That belief is the foundation on which everything rests. Every regiment that marches, every void fleet that burns through the darkness between stars, every inquisitor who carries out acts of terrible necessity because they are convinced, deep in the marrow of their bones, that there is a divine purpose behind them. The faith is not incidental, it is structural. It is the load-bearing wall of human civilization, and almost every important truth about the being at the center of that faith would crack that wall right down the middle. This is the video I have been building toward. This is the question that I think makes Warhammer 40,000 not just one of the richest fictional settings ever constructed, but genuinely one of the most philosophically interesting. Because the question is not simply, is the Emperor good or evil? That framing is too small. The real question is this: if the people of the Imperium knew the full truth about who and what the Emperor actually is, what he did, what he bargained for, what he chose to hide, and what he is slowly becoming right now as you watch this video, could they survive that knowledge? Would the Imperium still hold together? Would the faith that keeps humanity alive in a hostile and indifferent universe survive contact with the facts? I want to walk you through all of it, slowly, carefully, because this deserves patience. We are going to start at the very beginning, back before there was an Imperium, before there were Space Marines or Primarchs, or even the Great Crusade. We are going to start in a small village on a river bend in ancient Anatolia, in a moment when the man who would one day sit on a golden throne and be worshipped as a god was born an ordinary child. And then we are going to follow the thread of secrets he has kept ever since. Part 1. The Weight of a Billion Prayers. Before we get to the secrets, you need to understand what is actually at stake, because when people ask what the Imperium is built on, the easy answer is warships and bolters and Astartes in ceramite armor. But that is the surface of the thing. Underneath all that metal and firepower, the Imperium runs on something much stranger and harder to quantify. It runs on absolute, unquestioning belief in a being who may not be what he claims to be, or what his church claims for him, or what the faithful imagine when they close their eyes and pray. Think about the structure of the Imperium in the 41st millennium. Think about what you need just to make it function. You need the Astronomicon, that immense psychic beacon blazing out from Terra like a lighthouse in a storm, without which the navigators cannot steer their ships safely through the warp, without which the entire Imperium fragments into isolated pockets of humanity, cut off from each other and picked apart one by one. The Astronomicon runs on the Emperor. It runs on his psychic power, amplified through the Golden Throne, and supplemented by the lives of roughly 1,000 psychers a day, every single day, consumed to feed its light. If you believe the Emperor is a god who willingly sacrifices himself for humanity, that 1,000 per day feels like sacred martyrdom. If you understand what the Astronomicon actually is and how it got built, it starts to feel like something else. Then you have the Space Marines. Millions of words have been written about the Adeptus Astartes, and they exist in a very particular relationship with the Emperor. They are created from his genetic legacy. They carry his gene seed in their bodies. They are trained almost from childhood to view him as a father, a creator, something beyond human. Their chaplains beat that devotion into them alongside combat doctrine and tactical logic. And it works. It produces warriors of extraordinary psychological stability and moral purpose. Men who can walk through the worst that the galaxy has to offer and come out still fighting. But that stability has a specific shape. It depends on the story being true. It depends on the father and son's relationship being genuine. There is at least one Primarch who reached the Emperor after the Horus heresy, looked at him, and came away believing that the Emperor regarded him not as a returning son, but as, in his own bitter words, a craftsman having found one of his more useful tools. That Primarch was Robut Guilliman, who arguably knows the Emperor better than anyone left alive. We will come back to that later. You have the Inquisition, an organization built on the premise that the Emperor's will must be protected, that there are truths so dangerous that ordinary humans cannot be trusted with them, that some knowledge is heresy simply by virtue of existing. The Inquisition has been killing people for 10,000 years to keep certain questions from being asked too loudly. The sheer existence of the Inquisition's most secretive branches tells you something important. Powerful people who serve the Emperor with absolute sincerity have spent millennia deciding that there are things his faithful must never know. What are those things? Why do they require organizations equipped with armies and blank authorization to kill anyone who gets too close to the wrong answer? And then there is the Ecclesiarchy, the Adeptus Ministorum, the Church of the God Emperor, that vast sprawling institution with its cathedrals and its cardinals and its confessors and its flagellants and its sisters of battle. The Church teaches that the Emperor is divine, that he is the one true God of humanity, that his sacrifice upon the golden throne is a willing act of love, a father dying slowly so his children can live. The Church teaches this so loudly and reinforces it with such relentless institutional power that to question it in most parts of the Imperium is to invite death. And here is one of the first and most remarkable pieces of the puzzle. The man the Church is worshipping explicitly did not want to be worshipped. The Emperor spent centuries during the Great Crusade insisting, with the force of a man who could reach into your mind and rearrange your thoughts, that he was not a god. He built an entire ideological framework called the Imperial Truth around the principle that humanity had to leave religion behind. He punished a Primarch severely for worshipping him, and yet here we are, 10,000 years later, and his servants are burning people alive for not worshipping him enough. How do you get from there to here? That question is one of the deep veins of this story, and the answer involves secrets that go all the way back to the beginning. But before we follow that thread, I want to add one more layer to the picture of what the Imperium actually is, because it matters for understanding what would happen if these truths were ever revealed. Consider the Inquisition, not as an abstract institution, but as a philosophy. The Inquisition exists on the philosophical premise that some truths are so dangerous that they must be suppressed, by any means necessary, up to and including the deaths of the people who possess them. This is not a fringe position within the Imperium. It is one of the foundational axioms of imperial governance. Certain knowledge is heresy, not because it is wrong, but because the having of it is itself a destabilizing force. The Inquisition has killed uncountable billions of people over 10,000 years, many of them innocent of any real wrongdoing, because they were in proximity to information that the Imperium could not afford to let circulate. And here is the thing. The Inquisition is right, not morally right, not in any simple ethical sense, but right in the structural sense that the things it suppresses are genuinely dangerous. The Inquisition kills people who know too much about the warp because warp knowledge is infectious, because knowing how to contact demons means that demons can contact you, because in the psychic ecology of the 41st millennium information about chaos is not neutral, The Inquisition kills people who have seen certain things, or read certain texts, or spoken with certain individuals, because the universe they inhabit is one where knowledge has a different relationship with danger than the one ordinary humans understand. In our world, knowing a dangerous thing puts you at risk. In the 40K universe, knowing a dangerous thing can put the entire species at risk, because the things that are dangerous are actively looking for conduits through which to act. And a human mind that holds the right kind of knowledge becomes exactly the conduit they need. This is the deep structural reason why the truths about the Emperor are so dangerous. It is not just institutional embarrassment. It is not just political instability. It is the fact that in a universe where the Chaos Gods are real, where they can reach through the warp and touch minds that are in the right kind of emotional state, revealing the full truth about the Emperor to hundreds of billions of faithful, humans would generate a psychic event of almost unimaginable scale. The betrayal, the anger, the grief, the disillusionment, the sudden collapse of the belief structure that gives meaning to suffering across the entire breadth of the Imperium. All of that emotion would ring in the immaterium like a struck bell. And the Chaos Gods, who have been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of moment, would be there to answer it. The Imperium suppresses these truths not just because they would cause political trouble. It suppresses them because the psychic consequences of their revelation in the specific universe where they exist would feed the very enemies they are trying to fight. The lie is load-bearing in more ways than one. Part 2. What he actually is. Born from the dead. The year is somewhere around 8000 BC. The location is central Anatolia, in a settlement of herders and farmers, on the banks of what will one day be called the Sakarya River, though no one there has that name for it yet. A child is born. His parents are ordinary people. His siblings will be ordinary people. He will not be. Before we can understand what happened in that settlement, we have to understand the world that existed in the warp before his birth, because what happens to the Emperor is inseparable from what is happening in the Immaterium during the Neolithic period. The Chaos Gods, those massive thought-form entities that feed on human emotion and psychic resonance, are not yet fully formed. They exist as vast embryonic presences, hungry and growing, fed by the slowly swelling emotional outputs of a species just beginning to develop complex inner lives. Humanity at this point in history is one of the youngest and most psychically energetic species in the galaxy, and as their emotions, their fear and love and violence and desire, wash into the warp, they nourish these growing entities. At the same time, humanity has its own kind of warp-touched individuals. They are called shamans, not in the degraded folkloric sense, but genuinely psychically capable human beings who can reach into the immaterium and draw from it. They serve their communities as guides, healers, readers of signs. They have an additional ability that matters enormously to this story. When a shaman dies, their soul does not dissolve into the warp the way an ordinary person's does. It drifts safely through the currents of the immaterium and finds its way back, reincarnating into a new body, carrying memories and knowledge from lifetime to lifetime. They are the original immortals of humanity. But that ability is failing. As the chaos entities grow, they grow hungry in a specific way. They are learning to intercept souls. The shamans begin to find that their reincarnation is no longer guaranteed. Some of them die, their souls stolen by things with no names yet in the darkness of the warp. The others watch this happen and they understand, with the clarity that comes from spending several lifetimes developing your ability to read the shape of the future, that they are running out of time. Within a handful of generations, there will be no shamans left. And without the shamans to guide humanity, to provide the psychic immune system against the growing threat of chaos, the species will be vulnerable in ways that no physical danger can compare to. Think about the weight of that for a moment. These people can see what is coming. They have spent multiple lifetimes developing foresight as both a skill and a survival mechanism. They know, with something approaching certainty, that they are the last of their kind, and that when they are gone, the species they have shepherded will be alone in a universe that is actively trying to consume them. They have no precedent for this situation, no ancestor's memory to draw on that shows them a way through. They must solve a problem that has never existed before, using capabilities that are already beginning to fail, before the window of their collective power closes entirely. So they make a decision. Thousands of them, gathering across what we would call the ancient Middle East, arriving at a single terrible conclusion. They cannot continue as they are. Scattering their soul energy across thousands of separate reincarnations leaves each of them individually weak enough to be swallowed. But what if they stopped scattering? What if they gathered all of it together? Every soul, every lifetime of accumulated wisdom and psychic power, into a single point. They take poison. Together. All of them. Thousands of shamans, the most powerful psychic individuals humanity has ever produced up to that point, dying in a single synchronized wave. Their souls rush into the warp, not as scattered sparks that can be picked off one by one, but as a single enormous surge of psychic energy. The warp entities that have been hunting them are overwhelmed by the scale of what hits them, and in that moment of collision and chaos, something new is formed. Not scattered shaman souls awaiting rebirth. Something else. Something that is simultaneously all of them and none of them. A single consciousness assembled from the wreckage of thousands. 1 year later, a normal family in that settlement on the Sicaria River has a child. The child is born immortal. The combined soul energy of thousands of shamans, folded into a single body, renders the organism effectively indestructible from birth. The psychic power that comes with that soul is so immense that it alters the child's genome in the womb, rewriting the biological code before the body even finishes forming. This is a being who is physically human. He has parents. He has brothers and sisters who are entirely ordinary. He cries and sleeps and grows through childhood the way children do. But he is carrying something that has never existed before in all of human history. A soul so vast it has no comparison. A psychic light so bright that the chaos entities that reach for it find themselves burned rather than feeding. The Citan, those star god entities that have been old since before the first sun burned, apparently encounter him at some point and form their own assessment. In the far future, a trapped shard of one of them describes the Emperor simply as a weapon. Not a man, not a god. A weapon. The oldest, most powerful psychic weapon humanity ever produced, walking through history unrecognized, waiting for the moment to be deployed. Whether the shamans understood this, whether they knew they were building a weapon rather than a savior, whether those two concepts were even meaningfully different in their framework, the lore does not say. Here is what I want you to sit with. This being grows up in a village. He herds animals and learns language and watches the seasons turn. He begins to realize, slowly, that he remembers things he was never told. Thousands of lifetimes of memory begin surfacing, the accumulated experience of every shaman who went into the making of him. He remembers languages no one around him speaks. He remembers wars fought by civilizations that have not yet been born. He remembers futures as clearly as memories. He begins to understand what he is, and more importantly, what he is for. And he keeps quiet about it. He watches, he learns, he waits. That waiting will last a very long time. And during that waiting, something crucial is established that will define every decision he makes for the next 10,000 years. He learns, from the very beginning of his conscious existence, that the truth about what he is must be managed carefully. That most people, confronted with the actual nature of the thing in front of them, would not be able to handle it productively. He learns early the terrible lesson that the most powerful tool is secrecy, and having learned it from the first moments of his awareness, he never fully unlearns it. Part 3. 10,000 years of the long game. One of the hardest things to truly comprehend about the Emperor is the duration of his conscious existence before the Great Crusade. We think of him primarily as the founder of the Imperium, the architect of the Great Crusade, the being on the Golden Throne. But those things account for roughly 3,000 years out of a life that stretches back nearly 10 millennia before any of them happened. He was born around 8000 BC. He reveals himself openly as the Emperor of mankind in approximately the 29th millennium AD. That is approximately 10,000 years of living in secret. 10,000 years. Let that number sit. For context, the entirety of recorded human history, everything we know about every civilization from the first writing in Mesopotamia to the present day, fits inside roughly 5,000 years. The emperor lived through the birth and death of every ancient civilization you have ever heard of, and thousands more you have not. He watched the Egyptians build their monuments. He watched Rome rise and fall. He lived through the medieval period and the age of exploration and the Industrial Revolution and everything that came after. He was there for all of it, walking through human history like a ghost wearing different faces, sometimes intervening, sometimes watching, always patient. Various sources in the lore suggest that he appeared in different guises across human history, not always as a warrior or a king, sometimes as a philosopher, sometimes as an advisor in the background, shaping events through influence rather than direct action. He accumulated knowledge at a pace no ordinary human lifespan could allow. He learned governance and medicine and warfare and diplomacy and the deep patterns of how civilizations form and collapse. He made mistakes, presumably, and had centuries to reflect on them before trying again. He was also watching the galaxy, the dark age of technology, that glittering period when humanity achieved interstellar mastery and built wonders that the 41st Millennium cannot replicate, was both a peak and a catastrophe in preparation. The Emperor watched humanity spread across the stars and build artificial intelligences and colonize thousands of worlds and achieve things that no other species in history had achieved so quickly. He watched the men of iron rise and the wars that followed. He watched the age of strife begin, the psychic catastrophe that comes when humanity's growing psychopopulation crosses a threshold that makes warp travel suddenly, terrifyingly unreliable. Ships are lost. Worlds are cut off. The great human civilization of the Dark Age shatters into thousands of isolated fragments, each fighting for survival in a galaxy that was never kind to the unprepared. The Emperor does not step into this chaos immediately. He is still waiting, still preparing, still working through what he knows is coming, what he has been able to see in the warp's probability currents for thousands of years. He knows what the age of strife will produce. He knows that on the other side of it, when the storms that cut humanity's worlds apart begin to ease, there will be a window, a specific, limited window of time during which the right force, moving with the right combination of military power and ideological clarity and sheer unstoppable momentum, can reunify the species before the galaxy's other inhabitants. The Orcs, spreading their tribal wars across star systems, the Eldar dealing with the aftermath of their own catastrophe, the emerging chaos powers looking for new vectors of corruption, close that window permanently. He steps out of the shadows on Terra during the Unification Wars. His first creations are the Thunder Warriors, genetically enhanced soldiers built for the specific purpose of unifying the fragmented and warring nations of humanity's home world. The Thunder Warriors are extraordinary. They are also, we later learn, intentionally flawed. They are designed to be powerful enough to conquer Terra, but not stable enough to survive for long afterwards. Their gene seed is imperfect in ways that will eventually kill them from the inside. The Emperor builds disposable weapons and then disposes of them. The Thunder Warriors who survive the Unification Wars are hunted down and killed before they can become a problem. The Emperor does not warn them. He does not tell them what they are. He does not give them the dignity of knowing that their design includes their own expiration. This is the clearest early example of a pattern that will define the emperor's entire tenure as the ruler of humanity. He builds things for specific purposes, uses them until their purpose is fulfilled, and then removes them when they would be more dangerous than useful. The Thunder Warriors are the prototype. The Primarchs and their legions are the more sophisticated iteration of the same principle. When Malcador admits that the plan always included eventually turning the Primarchs against each other to purge the unmanageable ones, the way the Thunder Warriors were purged, he is describing the same playbook being run at a larger scale with more complex instruments. During this period, he also begins to understand, with greater and greater precision, the shape of what is coming. His ability to read the warp gives him access to probability and prophecy that no human equivalent can approach. He can see centuries ahead with reasonable clarity, and what he sees is consistently and increasingly terrible. The warp is continuing to grow more turbulent. The entities that would eventually become the four great chaos gods are developing personalities and intentions. The galaxy outside humanity's small corner is vast and hostile, and full of things that would destroy humanity if given the chance. He sees the age of strife coming. He sees the psychic catastrophe that will cut human worlds off from each other. He sees what humanity will need on the other side of that catastrophe to survive. This is the foundation of the first and perhaps most important truth about the Emperor. He is playing a game with a planning horizon measured in tens of thousands of years, and he has been playing it longer than most human institutions have existed. When he makes a decision that looks cruel or arbitrary or short-sighted from any human perspective, it is being made against a backdrop of temporal awareness that makes every human accusation of short-sightedness somewhat ironic. He did not stumble into the Great Crusade or improvise the Primarchs. He spent thousands of years developing the theory, gathering resources, and positioning himself. But this is also where one of the most important criticisms of the Emperor originates, because a plan developed over 10,000 years, by a single mind, operating in total secrecy, without any mechanism for outside input or correction, is a plan with a very specific kind of weakness. It is brittle in the way that any sufficiently complex system becomes brittle when it assumes perfect information and perfect execution. The Emperor's plan is brilliant. It is also, in several crucial ways, profoundly fragile. And when things begin to go wrong, they go wrong in the ways that all long-term unilateral plans go wrong. Not because the planner lacked intelligence, but because no single intelligence, however vast, can fully account for the unpredictable. The first lie, in a way, is the very name he chose for himself. The Emperor. It is a title, not a name. In the early Horus Heresy novels, there are references to a name he used in the ancient past, Neoth, but even that name is not certain. The perpetual Erda, who knew him as well as anyone before the Great Crusade, knew him by that name, and the complicated nature of their relationship, which we will return to, suggests that even the people closest to him were given partial truths at best. He named himself Emperor, as if the title were simply a descriptor of his role, obscuring everything that came before it. 10,000 years of a life he had no intention of explaining to anyone. The Imperium would be built on the foundation of a man who never told anyone his real name. Part 4. Molech and the Price of the Primarchs. Now we arrive at one of the most discussed and most debated moments in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, the trip to Molech. And I want to be careful here, because the lore around this event is intentionally ambiguous, told to us primarily through sources that have every reason to mislead. A corrupted Horus, demon voices, the testimony of the Chaos Gods themselves. What I am going to tell you is what the lore presents, clearly labeled when we are in the territory of established fact and when we are in the territory of implication and interpretation. During the Dark Age of technology, before the Unification Wars, before the Great Crusade, before any of what we think of as imperial history, the emperor traveled to a planet called Molech. He traveled there with a small group of companions, including a perpetual named Olivia Soreka, and he traveled in a one-way spacecraft, not a ship he intended to bring back, a vessel designed to get him there with no expectation of a return journey by the same method. That detail alone tells you the trip was something he had planned carefully and considered deeply. On Molech, deep beneath the surface, he found something. A gate. A portal into the realm of chaos itself. The raw and undivided Imperium where the chaos gods hold court. This gate was ancient. Who built it, or why it was there, the lore does not definitively say. The emperor entered it. He went through alone, into the warp, into the domain of the very entities he had spent his entire existence in opposition to. What the lore records next comes from two sources, and both of those sources have to be treated with care. A demon tells Horus, during Horus's own visit to the Molech Gate, that the emperor made a bargain there, that he came before the chaos gods and offered them something in exchange for knowledge. The knowledge in question is the understanding of how to create the Primarchs. The ability to imbue genetically engineered beings not just with physical excellence, but with warp-given gifts. The charisma and psychic resonance that would make them more than just soldiers, that would make them leaders of mythic quality. The Lexicanum records that the Emperor emerged from the portal imbued with new powers and the knowledge required to ultimately create the Primarchs, beings whose creation would combine arcane genetic science with the energies of the warp. Now here is where interpretation becomes necessary. The Chaos Gods, according to the demon's account, say the Emperor broke this bargain. He took the knowledge and then refused to deliver whatever the other side of the deal required. This is consistent with everything we know about the Emperor's relationship with chaos throughout his life. He is called the Anathema, not just because he opposes chaos, but because he is constitutionally resistant to it. He is immune to the corruption that takes every other being of sufficient power. He can look at what the Chaos Gods offer and simply say no. The only being in the universe with that particular immunity. So the idea that he walked into a negotiation with the Chaos Gods, got what he wanted, and then declined to honor his end of it is entirely plausible from a character standpoint. But think about what this means. Think about what the Chaos Gods would have asked for. Think about what any being of sufficient cunning, offering to give the Emperor the power to create 20 superhuman warriors of near-divine capability, would have extracted in return. The lore strongly implies, through the work of authors like Graham McNeill, who wrote the Molech sequence, that the price was the Primarchs themselves, not their deaths, their access, the right to touch them, to name them, to reach into their development and plant the seeds of what would eventually become the Horus heresy. The Emperor, by some interpretations, agreed that the Chaos Gods could have a claim on his created sons, and he then tried to hide those sons behind Geller fields in a subterranean laboratory, and the Chaos Gods laughed and used a time loop paradox involving Argel Tal and corrupted word-bearers to reach through the Emperor's defenses anyway, and they scattered the Primarchs into the warp. If this interpretation is correct, then the Horus heresy, that war which killed billions and broke the Imperium, traces its origins to a bargain made in secret by the Emperor tens of thousands of years before it happened. A bargain he made unilaterally, told no one about, and then tried to avoid honoring, and failed. The man who would one day tell his sons that there are no gods in the universe had personally negotiated with gods. The man who would build his civilization on rational humanism had used warp-given knowledge to create the very superhumans at the heart of his crusade. And then there is Erda, the perpetual who helped in the creation of the Primarchs, whose genetic material is intertwined with theirs, who viewed them as her sons in a way that goes beyond scientific involvement. Erda's relationship with the Emperor is described in the lore as one of the longest and most significant relationships in human history, a partnership measured in millennia. She knew him as Neoth. She knew his plans. And at some point, she made a choice. According to some sources, it may have been Erda herself who scattered the Primarchs into the warp, not the Chaos Gods acting alone, not the Faustian bargain, but a woman who had worked alongside the Emperor for thousands of years, and finally, looking at what her children were being built to become, decided she would rather send them anywhere else in the galaxy than let the Emperor use them as tools toward an end she no longer believed in. Erebus and the Wordbearer's law suggests she was manipulated by chaos into this act, without fully understanding what she was doing. But the ambiguity remains. The Emperor created beings of near-divine power using warp-bargained knowledge, lost them immediately due to a combination of chaos interference and potentially the betrayal of his oldest companion, and then spent centuries finding each of them and bringing them home, one by one, pretending the whole time that their scattering was purely the work of his enemies. He never told any of them about Molech. Part 5. The Imperial truth was always a lie about a lie. When the Great Crusade begins, the Emperor brings with it an ideology. He calls it the Imperial truth, and on the surface it is genuinely appealing. It is a philosophy of rational materialism, scientific humanism, the idea that humanity has come of age and does not need the crutch of superstition and religion. In the Emperor's vision for humanity's future, there are no gods worth worshipping. There is only the ordered universe and the species that will master it. It is the most enlightened position imaginable, presented by someone with all the authority of a being who appears to be a literal demigod. The problem is that the Emperor knew it was false. Let me be precise about this, because the degree of the Emperor's hypocrisy here is remarkable. The Chaos Gods exist. The Emperor knows this. He has personally met them. He went to Molech and sat in their presence and negotiated with them. His entire life's work is fundamentally structured around the fact that they exist and are the primary existential threat to humanity. The warp is real. Demons are real. The entities that hungry psychers and corrupted minds reach out to in the dark are as real as any physical phenomenon. The Emperor does not believe in a materialist universe. He is working against a supernatural threat with a supernatural arsenal. And yet, he tells his legions, his primarchs, his administrators, the billions of ordinary humans being brought into the Imperium, that there are no gods, no warp entities worth worshipping, no supernatural powers worth acknowledging. He tells them this as settled fact. He uses the authority of his apparent omniscience to stamp out religion across the galaxy. He destroys temples and burns holy texts and executes priests as part of a systematic program of atheist state building. Why? There are a few reasons floating through the law, and they are not mutually exclusive. The most straightforwardly charitable reading is that he believed human worship feeds the Chaos Gods, that every prayer offered to a warp entity makes it stronger, and that by suppressing religious instinct entirely, he could starve the enemy. There is some truth to this. The Chaos Gods do feed on psychic energy generated by belief and emotion. A galaxy of humans fervently worshipping Khorne would be catastrophically bad. So atheist materialism, from a purely strategic standpoint, makes a certain kind of sense. But the problem with this reading is that it also requires the Emperor to be dramatically overconfident in his ability to sustain the lie indefinitely. Because the warp is real. The Chaos Gods are real. Any psyker with sufficient skill can find them. Any expedition into certain parts of space will encounter evidence of their existence. The lie only works if no one looks too hard, and the Emperor is building an interstellar empire. People are going to look. There is another reading, darker and more interesting. The Emperor is not just trying to starve the Chaos Gods by suppressing worship generally. He is trying to prevent the one specific kind of worship that would be most dangerous, worship of himself. He tells us this, in a way, through the Lorgar situation.
Honestly, this is one of those topics I keep coming back to, not because it's the most action-packed quarter of 40k lore, but because it genuinely unsettles me every time I sit with it. Like, the more you pull on this thread, the more the whole image of the Emperor just shifts. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. I think that's actually what makes 40K so special compared to the other settings. It never lets you feel comfortable. It gives you a hero and then it spends 10,000 years quietly asking whether that word even applies. So yeah, that's kind of why this channel exists, honestly. Because the stuff deserves more than a bullet point list. But anyway, let's go back to the video.
Lorgar worships him. Lorgar builds entire cities to his glory. And the Emperor's response is not gentle correction. It is brutal, public humiliation. He brings his most powerful sons to the world of Monarchia, and he levels the city, built in his honor, and he forces Lorgar's entire legion to kneel while he lectures them on their failure. He knows, in his deep historical way, what religious devotion to him specifically would produce. He has watched enough religions form around powerful figures to know that the faith always eventually supersedes the figure. A church dedicated to the emperor would end up prioritizing the church over the emperor, which is exactly what happens in the 41st millennium, where the ecclesiarchy is one of the most powerful political entities in human space and does not actually take instructions from the golden throne. But here is the sharpest edge of the hypocrisy. Lorgar, cast adrift from the ideology of the imperial truth that the emperor personally drove him away from, goes looking for real gods, and he finds them. The Chaos gods welcome him with open arms. They tell him the truth that the emperor denied. Yes, there are gods in the universe. Yes, the warp is real. Yes, spiritual power is real. And Lorgar, burning with the specific kind of righteous anger that comes from being told for decades that your deepest convictions are delusions, and then discovering they were accurate all along, writes the Lectitio Divinitatus. He writes the foundational text of the imperial cult, the same text that would become the holy scripture of the Church of the God Emperor after the heresy. The same prayers that are being spoken on a million worlds right now in the opening of this very video were authored by Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch who fell to chaos specifically because the emperor punished him for worshipping him. The holy book of the imperial church was written by the first Chaos Marine. Let that geometry sink in. There is something almost poetically tragic about Lorgar. He was the most devout of all the Primarchs. He wrote theology. He built cathedrals. He devoted his legion not to conquest in the brutal warrior sense, but to the spreading of faith, of a creed, of meaning. He was the Primarch who most wanted the universe to have spiritual significance. And the Emperor took that devotion, that genuine and sincere longing for transcendence, and crushed it in front of every brother Lorgar had. The Emperor did not just correct him, he humiliated him. He had the Ultramarines, the legion most celebrated for their competence and discipline, destroy Monarchia as a demonstration. He made Lorgar and his entire legion kneel by the force of his psychic will. He told them they were failures, that they had spent a century missing the entire point, and then he sent them back to the war. Lorgar spent a month afterward, locked in his chambers, speaking to no one but Cor Phaeron and Erebus, both of whom, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this moment. Both of whom had connections to the Chaos gods through Colchis's old faith that predated the Great Crusade. They were there, ready, the moment Lorgar's absolute faith in his father finally broke. The seeds of the Horus, heresy, were planted in that month of grief and anger, cultivated by men who understood that the most dangerous weapon is a true believer who has been given a reason to believe in something else. Meanwhile, the Adeptus Mechanicus is explicitly exempted from the imperial truth. The Emperor makes a separate deal with Mars, with the cult Mechanicus, that allows them to keep their religious framework, their worship of the Omnissiah, their machine god theology, essentially unchanged. He needs their technology. He needs their ships and their weapons and their titans. And so the Great Atheist Crusade has a practical exemption built into it from the beginning. The imperial truth was never a universal principle. It was applied selectively. It was always, in the end, a policy rather than a genuine conviction. The most generous reading of the Emperor's decision to deny the existence of the Chaos Gods is that he was trying to protect his people from a threat they were not equipped to handle. The most damning reading is that he was a man so certain of his own plan's correctness that he chose to manipulate the people around him rather than trust them with the truth. Both readings have evidence. The honest conclusion is probably that they are both true at the same time. This is how complex beings make catastrophic decisions. Not from pure malice and not from pure benevolence, from the collision of genuine care and absolute arrogance. Part 6. The Primarchs were never really his sons. The Emperor publicly frames the Primarchs as his sons. This framing is intentional and carefully maintained. He is their father. They are his beloved gene children, the greatest achievements of his vast intellect applied to the question of what the perfect human soldier leader would look like. When he speaks to them, when he watches them in battle, there is something that at least resembles paternal pride. And several of the Primarchs genuinely love him with an intensity that reads as entirely authentic. Sanguinius reveres him. Horus, before the fall, is devoted in a way that has no equivalent except the absolute love of a son for a father. Even some of the difficult ones, the broken ones, hold something that looks like love toward the distant figure on the throne. But consider the origin story of the Primarchs as told honestly, stripped of the father and son's framing. The Emperor goes to a warp gate on Molech. He negotiates in secret with the beings he has spent his entire life fighting. He acquires knowledge. He uses that knowledge to create 20 beings from his own genetic material, modified by warp-derived techniques, and begins growing them in tanks beneath a mountain on Terra. He does this secretly. He does not consult anyone. He does not share the method or the purpose even with his closest advisor, Malcador the Sigillite, until much later. The Primarchs are not born from a relationship. They are developed in a laboratory as instruments of a plan, the Emperor tells a corpse puppet of Konrad Kurz, in a moment of extraordinary revelation near the end of Kurz's life, that every Primarch was built for a specific purpose, that they were crafted to embody particular qualities, particular capabilities, particular archetypal roles in the Great Crusade. Kurz, the Night Haunter, was built as something that could instill terror on a civilizational scale. The purpose was there from the beginning. The character was engineered. Kurz was not a man who became monstrous. He was, by this reading, created to be a certain kind of monster because the Emperor needed that capability in his arsenal. How many of the Primarch's tragedies make more sense through this lens? Angron's butcher's nails, those crude neural implants hammered into his skull by the slave masters of Nuceria. The Emperor arrives to claim Angron and finds a warrior who has been neurologically damaged in a way that makes him a more effective killer but destroys his capacity for anything, resembling peace. The Emperor does not heal him. He is capable of doing things far more miraculous than removing implants. He leaves them. There are lore discussions among fans about why, and the most uncomfortable explanation is that the butcher's nails make Angron exactly the right kind of weapon for the purposes of the Great Crusade, even at the cost of everything that might have made Angron a son rather than a tool. Angron himself knows this. He says so in one of the most devastating lines in the entire Horus Heresy series, when he calls out his father for not saving his brothers on Nuceria, for not extending the same mercy to the people Angron loved that he extended to Angron himself. The Emperor saved Angron from a battle he was about to die in by teleporting him away at the last moment. He did not save the hundreds of slave warriors who had been Angron's only family, the people Angron was dying with by choice. He saved the weapon and left the heart behind. Perturabo, the Iron, Lord of the Iron Warriors, was gifted with an analytical mind of almost unparalleled precision, a genius for fortification and siege warfare and logistics that no other Primarch could match. He was also given a crushing awareness of the gap between his potential and his deployment, a deep and grinding sense of being undervalued and misused that drove him through the entire Great Crusade, assigned to the worst sieges, the grinding attrition fights that no one would remember, while his brothers earned glory in more dramatic campaigns. The lore describes him as a man who could see, with perfect analytical clarity, exactly how he was being used and how the use was destroying him, and who could not stop it from happening. Was that misery designed in? The Emperor knew what he was building. Was Perturabo's resentment built in as a feature, a pressure that would eventually need to be released in a controlled demolition? Magnus the Red is perhaps the most tragic of all. Magnus loved his father, with a purity that bordered on worship. He was the most naturally gifted psyker among the Primarchs, with an instinctive connection to the warp that gave him abilities the others could not match. He was also, throughout his life, trying to understand things he was not supposed to understand. He pushed boundaries with sorcery and arcane knowledge that the Emperor had explicitly forbidden. The Council of Nicaea, the great tribunal on psychic power, was in many ways staged around Magnus and the Thousand Sons. The Emperor uses the council to outlaw the practices Magnus has been developing, knowing full well, as a psychic being of immeasurable power who can see the broad shapes of the future, that Magnus will not fully comply, that his nature makes compliance impossible. Some readings of the Horus Heresy lore suggest that Magnus was always intended to end up on the Golden Throne as its operator, the one psyker powerful enough to sustain the Webway project. And if that is true, then everything the Emperor did to Magnus, the council, the restrictions, the setting up for the Prospero catastrophe, was either a terrible miscalculation or a cold move in a game Magnus never knew he was playing. Then there are the two whose names are not spoken, the 2nd and 11th Legions, the missing Primarchs, the empty plinths. Rogel Dawn, in the short story The Lightning Tower, looks at those empty spaces and reflects that their separate tragedies seemed like aberrations. He wonders, after everything, whether they had in fact been warnings that no one had heeded. The chamber at the end of Memory reveals that whatever happened to them was so catastrophic that even Dawn, who knew them personally, agreed to have his own memories altered rather than carry the knowledge of what was done to them and why. The reason they were erased was, according to what we are told, worse than the Horus Heresy itself, up to the point in the narrative where that judgment is rendered. 2. Primarchs, erased. For reasons so terrible that a man who endured the heresy thought those reasons were worse. And then there is what Malcador admits, in what he himself characterizes as possibly a lie intended to comfort a dying woman. He tells Sibelniasta that he and the Emperor had deliberately agitated the Primarchs against each other, that the whole plan, all along, included using internal tension to eventually purge the Primarchs, who were unmanageable, just as the Thunder Warriors who preceded them were purged when they were no longer needed. The heresy, in this reading, was not a surprise or a catastrophe. It was an intended mechanism of a larger plan, a controlled demolition of the legions that went badly wrong when the Chaos Gods accelerated and distorted the process beyond what the Emperor could predict or manage. Malcador says it might be a lie, but who tells a dying woman a lie this specific? And if it is true, even partially, then Horus's betrayal and the civil war that followed were not just the work of chaos, corruption, and wounded pride. They were, at least partly, the Emperor and Malcador shaking the tree and being surprised by what fell out. Robute Guilliman, returning to life in the 41st millennium, seeking audience with the Emperor on the Golden Throne, comes away saying that the Emperor looked at him not as a father welcoming home a son, but as a craftsman who had found one of his more useful tools. Guilliman is one of the most analytically gifted beings in human history. He is not reading the situation wrong. The Primarchs were weapons. Some of them were loved while they served as weapons. That love may have been genuine. The Emperor is not simple enough to be incapable of love. But it existed alongside the utility. And when the utility conflicted with the love, the evidence suggests utility won. Part 7. The Webway Project and the Throne that became a prison. Approximately 2 centuries into the Great Crusade, at the height of human expansion across the galaxy, the Emperor does something that his sons, his generals, his advisors find inexplicable. He leaves. He appoints Horus as War Master. He hands control of the entire military campaign to his most favored son, and he goes home to Terra and locks himself in a basement. To be precise, he locks himself in a vast underground laboratory beneath the Imperial Palace called the Imperial Dungeon. He brings with him a small army of Mechanicum tech priests and laborers. He recruits a special new caste of tech adepts called the Unifiers. And he sets about a project so sensitive that he does not tell even the Primarchs what it is. He tells essentially no one. Malcador knows. Constantine Valdor, the first Captain General of the Custodes, learns eventually. A custodian named Ra Endymion is eventually briefed. Almost everyone else, including the godlike warrior demigods prosecuting his war across the galaxy in his name, is left completely in the dark. The project is this. Beneath the Imperial Palace, there is a portal. Not something the Emperor built, but something older, something discovered. A gateway into the Webway, that impossible network of tunnels threading through a dimension adjacent to both real space and the warp, through which the Elder once traveled safely across the galaxy without ever touching the killing currents of the Imperium. The Webway is built of psychically resistant materials that humanity cannot replicate. Using those materials, a sufficiently powerful psyker can seal the Webway off from the warp entirely. It is, in other words, a way to travel faster than light without ever touching chaos. The Emperor intends to give this to humanity, all of humanity. He intends to build a human extension of the Webway, to thread new tunnels through it using human-constructed material, protected not by the ancient Eldar methods, but by his own psychic power, projected through a mechanism called the Golden Throne. Once complete, the Imperium would have access to an interstellar transport network that bypasses the warp entirely. The Navigators, those mutant families who monopolize safe passage through the Imperium, would become obsolete. Human expansion and communication would no longer be dependent on a hostile psychic dimension. And eventually, in the Emperor's truly long-term vision, with the warp transit problem solved, humanity could begin to evolve into the psychic species he believes they are destined to become, not reliant on the warp, but capable of mastering it, like the Elder at their peak, but better, free of the fall that shattered them. This is the real plan, not conquest for its own sake, not empire as an end. The Great Crusade is a means. The Webway Project is the next step. The Golden Throne is a tool to make the next step possible. The Emperor keeps it secret partly because he does not want the Navigator families, who would be economically and politically ruined by its success, to have advance. Warning. But there are other reasons too, less practical and more troubling. He does not want the Primarchs to know because he does not trust them with this information. He does not trust them to not react badly. He does not trust them with the truth of the plan they have been executing in his name. And this is the Emperor's fundamental flaw made manifest. He hoards truth the way a miser hoards gold, and he does it even when sharing that truth might have prevented catastrophe. Picture what those years in the Webway must have been like for the people stationed there. The Custodes and Sisters of Silence, assigned to guard the growing tunnel network, moving through a dimension that exists sideways to reality, where the architecture is alien and the silence is deep and wrong in ways that take time to feel but never stop feeling. The Mechanicum workers building new sections of tunnel in a material that their own technology cannot fully interact with. Prayer and technical ritual working in tandem, guided by instructions from the Emperor, projecting his awareness through the Golden Throne. These people cannot tell anyone what they are doing. They cannot explain their absence to families or connections outside the project. They are ghosts inside a ghost of a dimension, building something for a future they may not live to see. The Custodes who serve there know more than the workers. Ra Endymion, one of the Custodes tribunes, is briefed on the Emperor's broader plan during the years of the Webway War. The Emperor speaks to him in the psychic space of the Webway itself, and the conversation that follows is one of the most revealing in all the Horus Heresy literature. The Emperor explains slowly the full scope of what he is trying to build, not just the Webway transit network. The long game, the eventual evolution of humanity into something that can exist in genuine relationship with the warp, rather than being perpetually threatened by it. The entire Great Crusade, all that, war and death and subjugation, was a scaffolding. The real structure it was meant to support is something almost impossibly ambitious. A species that will survive not by hiding from the warp, but by transcending its vulnerability to it. Ra Endymion's response, on learning this, is to ask a simple and devastating question. If this is the plan, why did no one know? The Emperor's answer essentially amounts to, because I cannot afford the reaction. Because the Chaos Gods can read the emotional states of the people around me. Because knowledge creates reactions, and reactions create psychic signatures, and psychic signatures give the enemy information. The plan's most precious asset is its secrecy. This is the Emperor's most comprehensive defense of his information policy, and it is also where that defense begins to break down under scrutiny. Because the people building the Webway, the people dying in its tunnels to protect the work, the Custodes losing 90% of their number in a war no one outside the project even knows is happening, these people deserve to know what they were dying for. Whatever the risk of their emotional reactions, whatever psychic signatures their knowledge might have created, there is a human cost to asking people to sacrifice themselves for a cause they are not permitted to understand. And that cost is part of what makes the war within the Webway so haunting to read about. Those people died for something real and important and good, and they died without being given the dignity of understanding why. Because catastrophe is exactly what follows. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, and the most gifted natural psyker among all 20 brothers, discovers something. He discovers that Horus has been corrupted, that his brother, the War Master, the most beloved son of the Emperor, has fallen to chaos through the machinations of the Word-Bearers and the demonic sorceries of Erebus. Magnus knows this with certainty, and he also knows that the normal channels of communication are compromised. He cannot simply send a message. Chaos would intercept it. Horus would know the warning was coming. So Magnus does the only thing he can think of. He opens his mind. He calls on every scrap of psychic power his legion possesses, and he sends a direct telepathic transmission to the Emperor personally, punching it through the psychic wards of the Imperial Palace with sheer brute force. The warning arrives, but the transmission is like firing a cannon through a greenhouse. Magnus's psychic surge tears through the wards that the Emperor has spent years building around the Webway project. Every careful seal, every delicate protection that keeps the warp from leaking into the human-built section of the Webway is shredded in an instant. Demons pour through, not a trickle, a flood. The Mechanicum laborers working in the Webway tunnels are slaughtered within hours. The army of Custodes and Sisters of Silence stationed there are immediately engaged in a desperate battle for survival. The Emperor cannot leave the Golden Throne. He is the only thing keeping the portal closed. If he steps away, even briefly, the warp breach expands uncontrollably, and terror itself is at risk of being swallowed. He is trapped. The Webway project, which was supposed to be his gift to humanity, becomes instead his cage. Think about what this moment is. The Emperor's greatest secret, the project he trusted no one with, the plan he kept from even his sons, is destroyed by one of those sons trying to help him. Magnus did not betray him. Magnus was trying to save him. Magnus loved him, in that specific and agonized way that brilliant sons love fathers they can never quite reach. And the consequence of that love, expressed in the only way Magnus could think to express it in that moment, was the ruin of everything. The Emperor gets Magnus's warning and does not believe it at first. He has been so focused on the webway, so consumed by his secret work, that his reaction to the news of Horus's corruption is delayed and distorted. He is angry, genuinely, deeply angry, not primarily about Horus, but about the webway. He dispatches Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to retrieve Magnus for judgment, with an order to bring him back to Terra to answer for what he has done. Horus intercepts the order and twists it, convincing the Space Wolves that Magnus is too dangerous to be brought back alive. The Space Wolves destroy Prospero. Magnus and his 1,000 sons, betrayed by their father's failure to trust them, and destroyed by their brother's jealousy and a corruption they never chose, flee into the warp and accept Tzeentch's offer. The 1,000 sons become Chaos Space Marines, not because they wanted to serve Chaos, but because every door their father might have held open for them had been closed, one by circumstances they were never allowed to fully understand. 5 years the war within the Shashkars webway lasts. The Custodes, the Sisters of Silence, the Mechanicum workers, all of them fighting and dying in tunnels of the webway against demonic hordes, while the heresy burns across the galaxy outside. The Custodes are reduced by 90% over the course of that war. 90% of the most elite warriors humanity has ever produced, dead in a lightless, dimensional corridor that no one outside the project knows exists. All because the Emperor did not tell his sons what he was doing. All because sharing the plan, trusting the people who trusted him, was a step too far for a man who had spent 10,000 years learning to rely only on himself. He had planned for Magnus to sit on the Golden Throne when the Webway project was complete. Magnus was to be the one who maintained the portal, who kept the passage open and protected, while the Emperor moved on to the next phase of his plan for humanity. That was the role he had been designed for. The Emperor's disappointment with Magnus after Prospero, that cold and devastating reaction that confounds everyone who reads about it, makes a horrible kind of sense when you understand that Magnus was not just a fallen son. He was a destroyed component in a machine the Emperor had been building for centuries. Part 8. Did he know it was coming? One of the questions that haunts the Horus heresy is whether the Emperor knew, whether he could see what was coming and chose to let it happen anyway, or let certain things happen, or engineered certain conditions. Whether the catastrophe that killed billions and broke the Imperium was, on some level, part of the plan. The honest answer the law gives us is complicated, and I think the complication is the point. The Master of Mankind novel, one of the most important books in the Horus Heresy series, shows us an emperor who has run the futures in his mind countless times. He has looked down the probability branches. He has seen, in the deep currents of the warp, every version of events that could possibly follow from his choices. And what he has seen, almost universally, is catastrophe. There is virtually no future he can find in which things go entirely right. The variables are too many, the chaos gods too cunning, the scale of what he is attempting too vast. He is not infallible, and he knows it. He has seen so many possibilities in which some Primarch or another falls, some legion or another turns, some catastrophe or another unfolds. The heresy, or something like the heresy, appears again and again in his visions. It is not a surprise in the way that a truly unpredicted event is a surprise. It is more like watching a storm you saw coming from 100 miles away, believing you have time to prepare, and still finding yourself caught in it. But the Malcador admission adds something darker. If they deliberately agitated the Primarchs against each other, if the plan always included using internal conflict to purge the unmanageable elements before, those elements could threaten humanity's future. Then the question shifts. It is no longer just did he see it coming. It becomes, did he help create the conditions for it? Did he choose, with full awareness, to push his sons into conflict because he calculated that the resulting war would serve his longer-term goals, even if millions died? The Cabal, that ancient organization of aliens and humans who have been fighting chaos for longer than the Imperium has existed, presents the most brutal version of this possibility. They approach the Primarch Alfarius Omegon with a proposition. The Cabal has seen the possible futures too. They believe that the only way chaos can be defeated permanently is if Horus wins the heresy. Not because chaos winning would be good, but because a victory by chaos would result in such total devastation that it would starve the chaos gods themselves of the psychic energy they need. A galaxy of charred ruins and dead humans produces no emotion, no fear, no war, no worship, nothing to feed on. Chaos would, eventually, die. The alternative, a loyalist victory, means a continuing Imperium, and a continuing Imperium means continuing suffering, continuing war, continuing feedstock for the Chaos Gods indefinitely into the future. The Cabal's cold mathematics say that billions dead now is preferable to trillions dying over the next 10,000 years. Alfarius presents this to his twin, Omegon. The Alpha Legion's canonical choice and its consequences ripple through the heresy in ways that are still being unpacked. But the Cabal's analysis, regardless of whether Alfarius acts on it, is worth sitting with. Is the Emperor aware of it? Does he know that his victory, if he achieves it, condemns humanity to a slow torture rather than a quick ending? He is certainly capable of knowing. He is certainly capable of accepting it. A man who could calmly watch the Thunder Warriors, the superhuman soldiers who unified Terra, be betrayed and exterminated when their usefulness was exhausted because they were never intended to be a permanent part of the picture, is a man who can hold the weight of enormous necessary sacrifices. There is also the question of Horus, specifically. The Emperor is shown, in various sources, as having a form of foresight that can identify specific individuals and specific events as pivotal. He knows Horus is the most important of his sons. He knows something will happen with Horus. He makes choices, like the trip to Molech, like the suppressed memory of Molech given to Horus and the other Primarchs who were there, like the slow positioning of Horus as War Master at the precise moment the Emperor needs to withdraw from the crusade. That only makes sense if he has a plan involving Horus that goes beyond what he tells anyone. Some lore theorists read those choices as evidence that the Emperor knew Horus would fall, needed him to fall, and set the stage for it. Others read them as evidence that the Emperor, for all his foresight, could not control every variable, and that Horus's fall was a near miss with a catastrophe the Emperor had hoped to avoid. What I will say clearly is this. The Emperor's failure to communicate with his sons is not a character flaw that exists in isolation. It is the systemic expression of a fundamental choice he made 10,000 years before the heresy, when he decided that he would be the sole keeper of the plan, the one intelligence in charge of all the variables. Every secret he kept, from Molech to the Webway to the genuine nature of the Primarch project, is downstream of that original choice. The heresy happens, in no small part, because men who were asked to die for a plan were never told what the plan actually was. Part 9. The Golden Throne is failing. Let us return to the present, to the 41st millennium, to the golden cage at the center of the Imperium. The Emperor has been seated on the Golden Throne for over 10,000 years. He was placed there after Horus's defeat, after Malcador the Sigillite gave his life to maintain the throne in the Emperor's absence during the final battle, after that ancient and brilliant man crumbled to ash so his master could go and face his son. The Emperor was brought back shattered, mortally wounded beyond what even his extraordinary body could heal. Put on the throne and kept alive by technology that was ancient even when it was first built, by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, by the power of the Astronomicon and the collective faith of trillions. And in that condition, he has sat for 10,000 years. What is happening on that throne? This is one of the most contested questions in the setting, and I want to give it the space it deserves. The clinical answer is that the Emperor is trapped in a twilight state between life and death. His body is sustained, but deteriorating so slowly that the degradation takes millennia rather than years. His mind is active, he is aware. He can send psychic impressions into the warp. He can, in certain moments, communicate through signs, through the Imperial Tarot, through visions sent to receptive psychers. He is not simply a battery powering the Astronomicon. There is something thinking in there, something that has had 10,000 years of imprisonment and pain and the daily consumption of human lives to contemplate what it has made. Let's be clear about the mathematics of what sustains him. Approximately 1,000 psychers per day, every day, for 10,000 years. That is 365,000 psychers per year. Over 1,000 years, that is 365 million human lives. Over 10,000 years, the span from the Horus heresy to the 41st millennium, the number approaches 3.5 billion souls, consumed to keep one body functioning. Each of those people was a psyker, which means each of them was psychically gifted, which means each of them had capacities and potential that made them unusual among humanity. 3.5 billion potentially extraordinary human beings fed to the throne, their life force absorbed, their individuality dissolved into the white noise of the machine's hunger. And that number has been increasing. By the late 41st millennium, the throne requires 4 times the original rate to maintain optimal function. Not because the emperor has grown more powerful, if anything the opposite, but because the machinery is failing. Parts that cannot be replaced because the knowledge to make them was lost in the age of strife. Connections that degrade with use and cannot be fully repaired by tech priests who understand perhaps 20% of what they are maintaining. The great undertaking of keeping the emperor alive has become a slow-motion catastrophe, its end visible on a long enough timeline, creeping closer with every year the throne runs without comprehensive maintenance. What has he concluded from his 10,000 years of contemplation? We do not know. We genuinely do not know. The law is deliberately ambiguous about the current state of the emperor's mind. There are hints that he is not entirely sane, that 10 millennia of uninterrupted contact with the full weight of the warp, with the constant assault of every chaos entity that has ever existed, with the slow consumption of human souls to keep himself anchored in the material world, have done things to a consciousness that was never fully human to begin with. One of the old Inquisition war novels paints a picture of a being so fragmented that when Inquisitor Jack Draco reaches the throne room, he encounters something like multiple personalities, different aspects of the Emperor's shattered consciousness, performing different functions. One, the cold authoritarian demanding punishment for the intrusion, another, the softer and more uncertain voice that had actually stopped time to let Draco reach him, because that voice wanted to tell him something. Whether this fragment of lore remains strictly canonical in the current era is debatable, but the image it presents, a consciousness broken into functional shards by the pressure of what it has endured, is entirely consistent with what we know about the Emperor's situation. What we do know is that the throne is failing. By the late 41st millennium, the technology supporting it has degraded to a point where the tech priests can no longer fully repair it. They understand only pieces of how it works. The systems that were once merely inefficient have become increasingly unreliable. The number of psychers required to sustain the throne's operation has multiplied. What once required 1,000 a day eventually required 4 times that number. There is a failsafe, a device installed by Vulcan at the Emperor's direction called the Talisman of 7 Hammers, which serves as a dead man's switch. If the Golden Throne fails completely, if the Emperor dies and the psychic seal on the webway portal breaks and the demonic tide begins to rush through, the talisman will detonate. Not just the Imperial Palace, not just the Himalayan mountain range. Terra itself, destroyed, so that the Chaos Gods cannot claim humanity's homeworld as a trophy and a staging point. The Emperor has been sitting on a bomb pointed at Terra for 10,000 years. The Imperium does not know this. In the 41st millennium, the situation becomes desperate enough that a faction within the Mechanicus, working with elements of the Inquisition's more extreme wings, makes a decision that would shake the Imperium to its foundations if it became public knowledge. They mount an expedition through the webway, not the Imperial extension. That collapsed long ago. They push through into the broader Elder network, fighting through Harlequin troops and demonic incursions alike. Their destination is Comorra, the labyrinthine nightmare city at the heart of the Dark Eldar's power. Their goal is to find someone who understands the Golden Throne's mechanisms well enough to repair it. And they make a bargain there, in the dark heart of a city built by tortured souls and sustained by suffering, with beings who have been practicing cruelty as a fine art for 10,000 years. The bargain involves things that the Imperium would classify as unconscionable. It involves handing over billions of human lives as slaves and giving the Dark Eldar access to the throne's schematics. Whatever the Mechanicus hoped to gain, the fact that they went to those lengths tells you everything you need to know about how desperate the situation has become. And then, there is the question of what the Emperor is becoming. The Chaos Gods feed on the energy generated by belief and worship. Billions of humans praying to the Emperor every day, sincerely, intensely, with the desperate faith of people who need a god because the universe around them is genuinely terrifying. That faith generates psychic energy. It flows into the warp. It flows toward the Emperor. It makes him stronger in certain ways, and it does something else as well. It is, slowly, whether he wants it or not, turning him into what his faithful already believe him to be, a god, not a human being, not the mortal-born hybrid of thousands of shaman souls, a warp entity, a deity in the same fundamental sense as the Chaos Gods. There are visions and prophecies scattered through the lore of a thing called the Dark King. A fifth Chaos God, an entity prophesied by both Eldar seers and human mystics, whispered about in the deep archives of the Black Library and in the coded nightmares of psychers across the galaxy. During the Siege of Terror, at the height of the final battle on the Vengeful Spirit, the Emperor realizes that Horus, as he stands in that moment, fully ascended, carrying the power of all four Chaos Gods, cannot be defeated by a mortal being, however extraordinary. So the Emperor does something he has avoided his entire existence. He reaches into the warp and he drinks from it, deeply, the way the Chaos Gods feed on it. He begins to ascend. He begins to transform. Malkador, sensing what is happening from across the distance, recoils in horror because he can feel what his oldest friend is becoming. The Emperor, in that moment, is on the verge of becoming the Dark King, a being of utter annihilation, a force of merciless judgment and cruel rationality, something that could destroy Horus, but would, in doing so, destroy everything else as well. The Eldar and human seers who have prophesied this entity describe it as a force of destruction without purpose, nihilistic down to its fundamental nature. Not evil in the way the Chaos Gods are evil, not fed by specific negative emotions, but simply the obliteration of meaning itself. An end. He is talked back from the edge. Biolanius Person, a perpetual, a mortal man who has lived long enough to know the Emperor from before any of this, who stands in front of the ascending entity and reminds it of what it was and what it chose to be. The Emperor, shocked to encounter someone he had not seen in millennia at that precise moment, in a coincidence so improbable that it can only be the work of fate or something resembling it, chooses to release the power. He chooses to be the man who might lose rather than the god who could win, and he goes back to face Horus as something closer to human. The blast of released power, when he lets it go, tears something away from him. It tears away the compassion, the love, the mercy, the hope, the softer qualities of his soul that he had been carrying through the long millennia. They shear off and drift into the warp. And that shard, that fragment filled with everything that made him capable of genuine connection, begins to float through the immaterium, slowly accreting, slowly growing, the way the Chaos Gods grew from fragments of psychic energy given form by accumulated belief. It becomes something. The lore calls it the Star Child, There are those who argue that the Chaos Gods planned for this outcome all along, that their goal was never simply to win the Siege of Terra. Their goal was to strip the Emperor of his humanity, one way or another, and leave on the Golden Throne not a being who might eventually reincarnate and return with his compassion intact, but a being that has been tortured into cold divinity. 10,000 more years on the throne, absorbing the worship of trillions, slowly becoming more powerful and less merciful, more godlike and less human, and what you eventually get is perhaps not the Star Child reborn. Perhaps what you get is the Dark King after all, wearing a golden face. Part 10. The Star Child, the Sensei, and the slow rebuilding of a soul. The Star Child is one of the oldest concepts in Warhammer 40,000 lore, originating in the earliest edition Realm of Chaos books, passing through periods of ambiguity and semi-retirement, and returning with new significance in the Siege of Terra series and the recent era of 40K development. And it is, I think, one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking ideas in the entire setting. Here is the theory, clearly marked as lore that exists in different levels of canonical certainty depending on which source you use. The Emperor, like the shamans who created him, may possess the ability to reincarnate. His soul, properly free of its physical anchor, could in theory do what those ancient shamans did when their lives ended. It could dissolve into the warp, gather itself together over the course of years or centuries, and be reborn. A new life, a new body, the same essential being, carrying the accumulated weight of everything it has ever been, but freed from the prison of the throne and the degrading shell of the body it has worn for 10 millennia. But it cannot be reborn while any part of it remains tethered to the body on the Golden Throne. The soul cannot leave to reincarnate if it is still anchored in the flesh. The Emperor is neither alive enough to act, nor dead enough to be reborn. He is caught. The Star Child, the fragment of his soul that sheared away during the siege, drifts in the warp. It is growing. It is accreting the psychic energy generated by genuine, sincere human faith in the Emperor, the way a star accretes dust and gas in a stellar nursery. It contains the best qualities of what the Emperor was: the compassion, the love, the mercy, the hope. And it is, slowly, being woven into something coherent. Not the Chaos Gods, which are fed by the worst qualities of conscious beings, the hatred and fear and obsession and excess. Something different. Something that represents the human capacity for genuine goodness, given warp substance. The Sensei are part of this story. The Emperor, across 10,000 years of living among humanity before the Great Crusade, had children. Not the Primarchs, who were engineered weapons. Natural children, born of real human relationships. Those children inherited something from their father, and so did their descendants. The sons of the Emperor's biological bloodline carry certain gifts. They do not age. They are invisible to psychic senses. Even the Emperor himself cannot perceive them through the warp, which is itself a remarkable detail. They are immortal wanderers, moving through the galaxy, drawn toward good deeds and righteous conflict, champions of something they may not fully understand, marked with what the old lore calls the mark of the Star Child. The Illuminati, a secret society of individuals who have achieved and then survived demonic possession, who have looked directly at the truth of chaos and come out the other side still sane, have a plan involving the Sensei. They gather them. They protect them from the Inquisition, which regards them with suspicion as potential chaos assets. And their plan, the plan they keep hidden from the Sensei themselves, is to sacrifice them at the critical moment of the Emperor's death, in the same way that the shamans sacrificed themselves 10,000 years ago. To pool that accumulated psychic heritage, all those lifetimes of wandering heroism and inherited soul fire, and give it to the Emperor's reincarnating fragment as fuel. To birth the Star Child into a new body, a Sensei Emperor, the new man, 2nd edition. The law in the 41st millennium shows visions beginning to appear across the Imperium, seen by astropaths and sensitive psychers. A golden infant, a radiant being rising from a throne of light. Visions traced to astropathic relays across the Imperium, filtered through the networks where human psychic energy concentrates. The Star Child is not dormant. It is dreaming in its way, and those dreams are leaking into the material world. There is a faction within the Inquisition called the Thorians, who believe the Emperor can be incarnated into a living body, a divine avatar, a physical vessel for whatever the Emperor has become after 10,000 years in the warp. They believe this is both possible and necessary. The Inquisition officially condemns this belief because of the obvious practical problems. An Emperor reincarnated into a mortal body might die again, and the failure would be catastrophic, and the power struggle over who was the true avatar would probably rip the Imperium apart. But the Thorians persist, because some truths are too compelling to be suppressed by institutional disapproval. And then there is the Terminus Decree, a Grey Knight's directive so sensitive that most of the Imperium does not know it exists. It states that the Emperor may never be allowed to leave the Golden Throne, not under any circumstances, not if he is revived, not if he is reborn in another body, not if he ascends as a warp entity. If any of those things happen, the Grey Knights are instructed to return him to the throne, no matter who opposes them, no matter what the Emperor himself wants, because the Astronomicon and the seal on the webway portal require him there. And without those two functions, there is no Imperium. And if there is no Imperium, then the alternative is something worse. The Terminus Decree is, among other things, a document that essentially says the Emperor cannot be allowed to save himself, even if salvation is possible, even if the Star Child theory is correct and there is a path to a second life. The structure that was built around him requires him to keep dying slowly on the throne indefinitely, because the Imperium cannot function without him there, and the Imperium cannot function without faith in him being there. And the moment either of those things changes, the whole thing collapses. Part 11. What happens when the faithful learn the truth? Now we have to ask the question that gives this video its title. Because all of these truths, the shamanic origin, the Moloch bargain, the Webway project, the Imperial Truth's hypocrisy, the Primarchs as weapons, the Star Child, the failing throne, the Dark King that the Emperor nearly became. All of these are the truths that the Imperium cannot know. And the question is why? What happens if they learn? The answers come in layers, from least to most catastrophic. The simplest layer is institutional. The Adeptus Mechanicus has built its entire civilization on the premise that the Emperor is the Omnissiah, the physical manifestation of the machine god, the source of all technical wisdom. If it becomes common knowledge that the Emperor got the knowledge to build the Primarchs by negotiating with chaos, that the Primarch project was a product of warp-derived sorcery, the Mechanicus's theological foundation is shattered. These are people who maintain technology through prayer and ritual rather than engineering understanding, because engineering understanding has been replaced by religious devotion to the machine spirits. Take away the divine status of the Emperor, and you do not just challenge a belief system, you undermine the practical methodology that keeps the fleet running and the guns firing. The next layer is the ecclesiarchy. The Church is the largest and most powerful non-military organization in the Imperium. It controls a substantial portion of the population's spiritual and psychological landscape. The Church has been built on the premise that the Emperor is God, that his sacrifice is divine, that his will is expressed through his servants on earth, that is, the Church's leadership. If the truth comes out, that the Emperor explicitly did not want to be worshipped, that the holy book of the Church was written by the first Chaos Space Marine, that the Emperor's own plan involved eventually stepping away from political power and fading into the background rather than being the permanent center of a theocracy. The church does not just lose credibility, it loses its reason for existing. And in losing that reason, it loses the control it exercises over billions of lives. The history of human civilization is full of examples of what happens when large, powerful religious institutions suddenly lose their foundational premise. Wars, schisms, the violence of people who built their identities on something that has just been taken away from them. The military layer is perhaps the most immediately catastrophic. The Space Marines, all of them, every chapter across the galaxy, are psychologically structured around their relationship with the Emperor. Their conditioning, their faith, their sense of purpose, all of it traces back to that central relationship. The chaplains who carry out that conditioning use it because it works. Because an Astartes who believes he is doing the will of the Emperor is functionally unstoppable in a way that an Astartes who believes he is doing the will of a 10,000-year-old political calculation is not. Remove the faith, and you do not have Space Marines anymore. You have very dangerous, confused men with no moral center, in a universe specifically structured to offer them an alternative moral center in the form of the Chaos Gods, who have been waiting 10,000 years for exactly this kind of opening. The Astra Militarum is even more fragile. The Guard is made up of ordinary human beings, hundreds of billions of them, fighting and dying on battlefields that would break the psychology of almost anyone who was not sustained by something beyond rational self-interest. The faith is the scaffold that makes it possible to stand in the path of a tyrannid swarm or a demonic incursion and hold rather than run. A soldier who believes the Emperor watches over him can do things a soldier who knows he has been conscripted to fight for a failing galactic government absolutely cannot. The moment that faith breaks, you do not just lose an army. You lose the willingness of the species to defend itself against threats that no individual has a rational reason to stand against. But there is a deeper and more existential layer beneath all of these institutional concerns. It is this. The Chaos Gods feed on psychic energy generated by conscious beings. Fear, anger, obsession, pleasure, all of it flows into them. But the Imperium has, entirely inadvertently, also been generating something else. Sincere faith, genuine love and devotion and self-sacrifice offered to a figure the faithful believe is worthy of it. That faith, those billions of prayers, that tidal wave of sincere spiritual energy, it has not been going nowhere. It has been feeding the Star Child. It has been building whatever the Emperor is becoming in the warp over 10,000 years of collective human worship. The Imperium, without knowing it, has been doing exactly what the Emperor feared his worship would do, creating a god. But it has been creating a specific kind of god, one nourished by the best rather than the worst of human experience. If the faith breaks, the Star Child does not just lose support, it may cease to grow. The project of the Emperor's eventual rebirth, the new man who might genuinely be able to stand against the Chaos Gods, might simply stop. The Chaos Gods, who have been watching all of this with the patient hunger of beings who experience time very differently from mortals, would fill the vacuum. They always fill vacuums. They are what remains when belief has nowhere else to go. This is the deepest irony of everything the Emperor has done. He spent 10,000 years before the Crusade insisting that religion was the enemy of human progress. He built the imperial truth on atheist principles. He punished the faithful and destroyed the cathedrals and tried to create a civilization of rational materialists. And in doing so, he created conditions that made the Horus heresy possible and the Chaos Gods stronger. Then his shattered body ended up on a throne that can only be sustained by the faith he tried to destroy. And the faith grew up around him anyway, written in the words of his enemies, sustained by the institutions that grew in the absence of his active leadership. And it turns out that the faith, that specific, sincere, desperate human love for a protector figure they can believe in, may be the one mechanism by which the Emperor survives, and the galaxy has any chance at all. The truth would not just destroy the Imperium, it would destroy the only path through. Part 12. The awful mercy of not knowing. I want to spend a moment here on something that I think gets overlooked in discussions about the Emperor's deceptions. The question of whether he was wrong to keep secrets is actually more complex than it first appears, and I say this as someone who finds his methods frequently appalling. Because the answer depends on what we believe about the capabilities of the people he was keeping secrets from. The Emperor, looking at ordinary humans, looking even at the Primarchs, sees something he fears. He sees beings who are psychically visible to the Chaos Gods, beings whose emotional states generate energy in the Imperium. Beings who, if told certain truths, would have emotional reactions to those truths that would ring like bells in the warp and give the Chaos Gods exactly the data they need to interfere with whatever comes next. When the Emperor tells Magnus that the reason he cannot share certain knowledge is that doing so would expose it to the ruinous powers, he is not entirely wrong. The warp is not separate from conscious thought. It is made of conscious thought. Every reaction to truth, every fear or anger or hope inspired by revelation is instantaneously visible to beings who live in the medium of those emotions. This is the most sympathetic reading of the Emperor's secrecy. Not that he thought his children were stupid, not even that he thought they were untrustworthy in an ordinary sense, but that he understood something terrible about the nature of the universe they inhabited, that knowing certain things in the warp-saturated galaxy of the 30th and 41st millennium is itself dangerous, not because the knowledge is wrong, but because the emotional reaction to the knowledge creates vulnerabilities that the Chaos Gods will exploit with absolute certainty and no mercy. He was not just keeping secrets, he was, by his own reasoning, keeping his children from becoming targets. And yet, this reasoning, even if we grant it full validity, requires a particular faith in the Emperor's own judgment that the rest of the evidence makes difficult to sustain. The Emperor, the being who chose his children's roles before they were born, who engineered tension between them as a culling mechanism, who went to Molech alone and made bargains in the dark, who kept his greatest project a secret until it was too late to defend it, who was so focused on the long view that he missed the human needs of the specific people in front of him. This being is asking us to trust that his calculations are correct, that his way is the only way, that the secrets were necessary. He may have been right. He may also have been the kind of man who becomes so certain of his own correctness that he stops checking his assumptions, and who ends up sitting on a golden throne for 10,000 years because the plan that was going to save humanity turned into the cage he could never escape. What I come back to every time I think about this is the conversation the Emperor had with the last priest on Terra, before the Great Crusade, before the Imperial Truth. There was one man left on Terra who maintained a church, who kept faith alive, who refused to abandon religion even as the Emperor was busy making atheism the law of the land. And the Emperor came to him, personally, and spent a long time talking with him. And when he left, he had the man killed. But in that conversation, the priest observed something extraordinary. The Emperor's great intellect, vast beyond measure, had no framework for understanding faith. He had never experienced the desperate human need to believe in something larger than yourself, to find meaning in suffering, to feel the presence of something beyond the visible world. He was so far beyond ordinary human experience in every other way, and in this specific and crucial way, he was genuinely unable to understand what his people needed. He planned magnificently for their survival. He could not plan for their hearts. Part 13. What is he now? We are in the 41st millennium. Over 10,000 years have passed since Horus's defeat. The throne is failing. The rift has torn the galaxy in half. Guilliman has returned and is rebuilding. And in his rebuilding, he is clearly aware that the institution he is trying to shore up has fundamental flaws that he does not know how to address without tearing the whole thing apart. What is the Emperor now? His body is a mummy. It is technically alive, sustained by the throne's mechanisms and the sacrifice of the daily psychers who are brought to him. But it is a degraded ruin of what it was. The muscles have atrophied over millennia. The neural connections are maintained by artificial means. What sits on the throne is not a functioning human body in any meaningful sense. His mind is something else. Something that has had 10,000 years of isolation and constant psychic assault, and the experience of every prayer offered by every faithful human being across a million worlds. Something that has been shaped by all of that in ways we cannot fully predict. The fragments of communication that reach out from the throne, the tarot, the visions, the occasional direct communication with a selected individual, suggest something that is still oriented toward the protection of humanity, but they also suggest something that has drifted from what it was. Something that thinks on timescales and in categories that are no longer entirely human. The dark reading, the one hinted at repeatedly in the lore, is that what sits on the throne is already, functionally, a god. Not the god the ecclesiarchy worships, not the divine father figure of the prayers, but a genuine warp entity housed in a failing biological shell, growing more powerful with every prayer offered to it, and growing less human with every passing century. The Star Child theory offers hope. The Dark King theory offers something much less hopeful. There may not be a clean separation between them. The Emperor may be simultaneously the hope of humanity's rebirth and the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, depending on how the next 10,000 years unfold, and which thread of the fraying soul on the throne pulls tightest. What Guilliman sees when he reaches the throne and speaks to whatever is there is something that looks at him with the eyes of a craftsman finding a useful tool. Something that has receded so far from the father and son framing that it can no longer perform it convincingly to the one son who knew him best. Something that may have loved once, but has had 10,000 years to make peace with what love costs, and has perhaps concluded that love is not a sustainable basis for strategy. Or something that is so damaged, so long past what any consciousness was meant to endure, that the love is still there, but can no longer be expressed in any form Guilliman can recognize. Both possibilities are devastating. The first turns the Emperor into a calculating machine that was always going to end here. The second turns him into a tragic figure of almost incomprehensible pathos, a being that may have genuinely loved his children, that may have wanted something real and warm and good for them, and that has been destroyed by the weight of its own impossible purpose into something that can no longer show it. The war, in the grim darkness of the far future, continues. The prayers rise from a million worlds. The golden light of the Astronomicon burns on, and at the center of it all, that thing on the throne holds whatever it has become, keeps the seal on the webway portal from breaking, and dreams whatever it is capable of dreaming, while the galaxy burns around it. Closing. The truth and the faith that outlasts it. I want to end with something that I think is easy to miss when you are deep in the theology and the lore and the analysis. Because it is easy, after spending this much time with the Emperor's failures and deceptions and terrible choices, to conclude that the faith in him is simply misplaced. That the people praying to him on a million worlds are fools, exploited by an institution built on a lie, wasting their devotion on a being that views them instrumentally. I do not think that is the whole truth. The prayers work. The faith works. Not in the way the faithful imagine, not through the direct, personal intervention of a benevolent God who hears each individual supplication and responds to it, but in the aggregate, in the structural way that the accumulated weight of sincere human belief does generate genuine psychic force in the warp, does sustain the Astronomicon, does feed the Star Child, does create the conditions where the Emperor's eventual rebirth might be possible. The faith is not pointing at a lie. It is pointing imperfectly and often at the wrong aspects of the truth, but pointing nonetheless at something real and important. The thing it is pointing at is not what the Church teaches, but there is something there. Sister Miria of the Adepta Sororitas would die for the god emperor without hesitation, and in her death, she would generate the same kind of psychic signature as the ancient shamans, a pure willing sacrifice that adds its energy to the impossible ongoing project of keeping the light on. The guardsman who holds the line against the Tyranids in the name of the emperor is doing something that matters, and it matters not despite the fact that the theology supporting it is complicated and partially false, but in some way because of the intensity and sincerity with which he holds to it. The universe of 40,000 is not a universe where truth defeats faith or faith defeats truth. It is a universe where both are real forces with real consequences, and the relationship between them is one of the central tensions of everything. The truth about the Emperor would destroy the Imperium, but the faith in the Emperor is helping to build something that might survive the Imperium's death. That is the knot at the center of this story. It cannot be untangled without destroying both strands. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also this, a being born from the deaths of thousands, who spent 10,000 years watching from the shadows, who bargained with gods and built weapons from the souls of men, who chose the worst possible cage for the best possible reasons, and who sits now in the dark of his dying throne, while the descendants of the people he loved fight and pray and hope in his name, becoming, despite everything, despite himself, despite every choice he made that brought him here, something that might actually deserve the faith being offered to him. The Emperor protects. Whether or not he was always worthy of protection. Whether or not we understand what he is protecting us from. Whether or not he can hear us. In some form that the lore continues to develop and expand and deepen with every passing year, he does.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.